Henry, I'd asked you about your garden previously, and you said your friend that y'all used to garden together. He's still living, isn't he?
Yeah, his wife broke her ankle. She's been recuperating for that. She just got started back on physical therapy Thursday.
I thought you told me that they just had some.
We're doing a little garden. It's not as big as what usual, but we got tomatoes and a couple of kinds of beans and squash, bell peppers, corn, of course corn. We planted our rows are not real long. We planted a couple, about half rows of corn, and then about 3 weeks ago we planted the other half Thursday. But we got watermelons, cucumbers, and cantaloupes. We just got a hill or two of each, and we got a few peanuts.
Peanuts. I've never raised any peanuts. I was at Kroger's last week, and I bought a huge cantaloupe. And of course, they've had cantaloupes and even watermelons and honeydew melons all winter long. I guess they're raised somewhere or in a greenhouse. But these obviously were just field raised. They had dirt on them. And I bought a big one that kind of smelled like it was ripening, and it was huge. It was big as a basketball about it. And I got that home this week, and I ate that, and it was the best cantaloupe I've ever had. It was just so sweet and soft, and so I don't. A lot of times I'll get one, and they're just hard as a rock. You know, they're just. You can. I don't know if this is true. It was true when I was working in grocery, but it's really, since Terry doesn't eat any fruit, it has seemed more economical to just to buy a tray that's got different kinds of fruit in it. But when I worked for Kroger's, the reason we made little trays is because, if you had a cantaloupe and it had a big old rotten place on it,
cut
that off, and then you cut up the rest and make a tray. So we did the same thing with chicken. You know, if chicken was bad or nasty or old or something was out of date, they'd cut it up and clean it up and play with it a little bit. Now I had heard of people actually using bleach before on food to get the color right. We never did anything that we felt would harm the customer, but I'm pretty sure they didn't know that they were getting fruit or meat that was just about to spoil.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've just really, and as I said, I don't know if they might have better rules now or better supervision now, but I'm real hesitant to buy anything that's been broken down, cut up, and put in little trays. I just
when I worked for Super X Drugs, and they're in Decatur, over there by Food World, when it was in the center across from Lowe's.
Mm-hmm.
And this was back in the late 80s, early 90s. And I worked next door, and the guy that was over there produce department, I was trying to think of his first name. My memory's not any good. His last name was right. His brother was married to my sister. They ended up getting a divorce later. They were still married at this time. And he was over their produce. And I went in there one day, and I'd go over and they had a deli sometimes and get what I eat for lunch. I was talking to him. He said, "You want some peaches?" I said, "You got some?" He said, "Yeah, we go through these peaches, and if they have a bad spot on them, I have to pull them out." And he said, "There's nothing wrong with them. In fact, they're usually riper and better than the others." So about every about once a week, he'd give me a big old box of peaches. We froze peaches. I carried my mother peaches, and them was the best peaches you eat. But you was talking about raising peanuts. When I was a teenager, we grew up on the farm. We raised a lot of watermelons. We'd have tons of watermelons and cantaloupes. We had a big garden. And one year I raised corn, and one year Daddy said, plant peanuts. Said you can always sell them, and said they bring a good price. So I planted me a bunch of peanuts, and when it come time, I just took them up, shook the dirt off, turned them bottom side up in the field to dry in the sun. Then I went over with the tractor and trailer, loaded them up, hauled them, stacked them in the barn. Then later I got out there and started picking off peanuts. And a bushel of peanuts is 22 pounds. And I put them in a burlap bag, and I weighed them. That's what I did. I sold a bushel of peanuts for $4 and thought I was doing good. Now a bag with a couple of pounds in it will cost you $4. But we raised watermelons. We'd go out there with a trailer and get a load up, bring them, pile them up under a tree in the shade. We had a spring down there. We'd throw us 2 or 3 in there. I get home from school every day. The first thing I did was get a watermelon out of the spring and eat it. So before I went to work in the field or whatever. So
yeah, I don't, like I said, Terry doesn't eat fruit, but when I bought that cantaloupe, I bought me a watermelon too. And I've always loved watermelon. Here you mentioned it, but I don't know why. I'm still, my mind hadn't made a lot of transition into being an older person now. But I picked out the biggest watermelon, and I guess it was just, I was just thinking I knew I was going to be getting more for my money, but I knew I'm going to be bringing that huge watermelon home, and I'm going to be the only one to eat it. So I wound up about Wednesday. It started tasting a little bit tangy, like it was beginning to ferment, and I cut it all up and got it off the rind, put it in bags and put it in the refrigerator. But I wound up throwing 2 bags of it away yesterday. It was getting where it was it was more than tangy. It was beginning to turn into watermelon wine. I think so. But my father-in-law still has a little bit of a garden, and almost every year he lets the grandchildren come there and help him plant. But I think they've been so busy this spring and summer that I asked the other day, and I think he's already he had to go ahead and get it planted. He couldn't wait on them to have a free day to come help, but maybe they'll help him harvest. We've got pictures of them over the years setting out tomato plants and putting seed in the ground, and they enjoy working with him. Of course, he enjoys it immensely. And then Bob used to have several fields in different locations where he planted corn, and he doesn't do that quite as much. But we used to, when the corn started coming in, you got to get it out of the field. So it was just almost. And I'm not to complain myself, because Terry and my sister-in-law and them, they bore the biggest weight of it. Carissa's helped too. I can't say that I'll help pick or pull ears, or probably a few years I shucked and silked, but it's been a while. Well, we're glad that I didn't check before I sat down to see if anybody tuned in with us. Henry is here with us today, and he's still got his bandage on his hand. He's going to have to be careful about handshaking today. He's going to fist bumping instead. But how's your blood levels? Are they about got it the way they want it to be, or it should be?
Well, it wasn't hard as where we wanted it, but I got to go Thursday and get it checked. It was coming back, so.
That's I've had family members or friends over the years that were on a variety of different kinds of medications, and it made going to the dentist difficult. If they ever had to have surgery or sometimes just a test, a procedure, they had to get off their medication for a while and then have whatever they was going to do and then get back on. When I picked Randy up today, he asked me how I was doing. I said, well, I feel, for some reason, I'm a little bit tired. Maybe it's been a hard week. And he said, what you need is some liver pills. And so he kind of did a commercial on liver pills from the health store. And I took it in good spirit, but I don't know about you, but I take so many pills that anytime anybody mentions to me that I need one more pill, it just doesn't sit well with me. I told him I'd rather eat some chicken livers but I don't even know I don't know if Kentucky Fried Chicken, even if you could get chicken livers there anymore.
Libby has chicken livers.
Does she? All right.
They're on her menu. So.
I'll head there next time. I guess that's one thing on her menu that I've never had and don't remember, but I'll make a note of that because it's something I usually, whenever I find a place, sometimes just a little old side of the road market there serve chicken livers, and usually whenever you buy any, they give you enough to feed 12 people. Just you pay $2 or $3, and it's just a whole box full of them. And it's always more than I can eat. But I don't. They have they taste like chicken livers, and that's why you get them. But I get a taste for them every once in a while, not often. But evidently, Mama didn't like them because we didn't have them growing up. I can't remember when I started eating them. But anyway, I didn't tell Randy that I didn't want another pill, but his heart was in the right place. I think I mentioned Barbara. She was kind of having cold and flu symptoms this week, and I don't know if she shared that with other members of the family, but she said she didn't want to share it with the church. So she texted me and said that she believes she needs to stay out of circulation this weekend. I told her that'd be fine. Hope that she's feeling better. And pray. I have a second cousin. Her husband passed away the weekend. Her name is Dana Castillo. It's Castillo. Her husband Steve passed away. I guess they're probably in their late 40s or early 50s. I still just kind of think of her as a little girl, a little tiny girl. And we see her, her sisters, Nicole and Gail, when we went up to Michigan. But her husband was a good man, and I've heard very kind and gracious words about him. We were not able to go to the memorial service, but he was buried this week. His name was Steve Castillo. Pray for Dana and their family, their kids. Have some good kids. I mentioned that Pat was in the hospital last Sunday, and Patricia Hood, but James called me Friday and said she's feeling some better. Appreciate all the diligence to get our air conditioning going. Our new unit is on the ground, and the sanctuary is cool and comfortable. But both Danny and Henry informed me this morning that we have another unit that's gone out. So we're taking steps to have that replaced, getting approval and so forth, and making an announcement. But grateful to members of our church for their faithfulness in giving and their generosity. Faithfulness even during the pandemic that I know in times past, here and other places where I've served, where the replacement of a heating or a cooling unit could be a tremendous challenge, and sometimes it was just almost a crisis. We are not, our coffers are not overflowing with money, but I am grateful. The Lord has blessed us and blessed our people, and they, as I said, they've been generous. So we can bear that without a tremendous strain, and I'm glad our leaders are on it. And I don't know how many dog years our units had on them, but I imagine quite a few. They're probably we probably have other units that are between 15 and 20 years old.
This one was 17. It's the one right out here. It's one that cools your office in this area here.
And it seems comfortable to me right now, but it's because we're getting circulation from other areas. Our units wouldn't be working as hard. We could probably get by a hot summer, but I imagine it's going to get even hotter in the end of June and July. We need that unit to kind of bear part of the burden. So 17 years. I know in the past, I've been pastoring churches a long time. We have spent a lot of money fixing and repairing. I know that a lot of times air-conditioned servicemen have been frustrated with churches, but I no telling how many times they've welded or put in Freon or patched and try to help little churches get by. But I'm glad that instead of it would have cost a tremendous amount of money just to replace the compressor on this one. So it is the better use of God's money. Just go ahead and get a new one. So I'm grateful for the time and trouble that has been spent, and there's more to be done. And meeting people down here at the church. I'm thinking through my mind. Let me put. I want to keep Pat on our prayer list. The summertime is hard for her because the heat is difficult. It makes it difficult for her to breathe. Some of our people are traveling. They have family gatherings. But today is homecoming at Walnut Grove, and I just saw the Herb family all pile out of their car here. And they're here for Sunday school, and I'm looking forward to hearing Thomas preach during our worship service. Let's have a word of prayer. We're going to begin a new series today on 1 and 2 Kings. So it's interesting material, and I haven't talked through the Kings and Chronicles in a long time. So let's see what the Lord might say to us about that. Lord, thank you for today. Thank you for homecoming. I pray that there might be someone around here in our neighborhood, our community, who needs a church to call their home, their church home, a place where they can find encouragement, a place where they, after finding or being found by a loving Savior, a place where they can have a family, a spiritual family who will love them and nurture them. Help us to be that, to be available, have our doors open, our arms extended, and always extending a word of encouragement and inspiration and invitation to all those who are around us, our friends and family, that inviting them to church is inviting them to you. Sharing our faith is not just a religious thing, but it is about a relationship we have with you. I see a great deal about religion and perhaps even spirituality, so-called, that doesn't look very appetizing or enticing, but knowing you and having a relationship with you is of not only great importance, but it is life-fulfilling. Lead us today. Show yourself to us. Demonstrate yourself in and through us. And if there is someone who comes into our midst today who needs you, I pray that they will find you here, and that we will help remove every obstacle that the dark has put in their way to come to the light. For we ask all of this, Lord Jesus, in your name. Amen. I've become interested lately, and there's a website on the internet called Chosen People Ministries, and their primary ministry is to Jewish people, and their message is that Jesus was and is the Messiah, that Jesus was the fulfillment of all the Old Testament messianic prophecies and promises. It's amazing that we all tend to make bugaboos out of each other and we demonize each other in a lot of different ways. I'm amazed and amused in these stories. They're really just testimonies. It'll turn a camera on a man or a woman, and they're Jewish, and they'll tell about how they came to believe in Jesus. And as they tell their story, so many of them say that they are first and foremost, completely shocked and surprised to find out that Jesus was Jewish, and to find out that the Bible is about Jewish people. It reminds me of an old, on the old sitcom when Archie Bunker, his son-in-law told him that Jesus was a Jew, and he just completely rejected that out of hand. But if they're, Jesus is depicted perhaps as the Catholic God, and maybe at the very best the Christian God. And in many of their testimonies, they tell that of their experiences with Christians, that many Christians that they have known have been unkind to them and have actually been very cruel or crude to them because they were Jewish, calling them Christ killers. God, that's an amazing thing, that a real Christian understands that it was my sin that caused Jesus' death on the cross, and I'm as responsible for his death as if I'd driven the nails in myself. But it seems to be historically accurate that Christians have often persecuted Jewish people and condemned them for being Christ killers. I don't know what in the world we would do if Jesus hadn't died. There's a responsibility for having executed Jesus, and that was a terrible thing that God used for good. It was his intention for Jesus to be a sacrifice. And the Jews had a part to play in that historically, but so did the Romans. And, ultimately, Jesus was a blameless person who didn't deserve to die, and he did. He chose to die for us, as not just as an example, but as a sacrifice. Well, as we look in the Old Testament and see about kings, the kings of Judah, the kings of Israel, we might say, what in the world has that got to do with us, and why should Christians study anything about the kings of Israel? Well, when these Jewish people, one of the first, most courageous things that they decide to do in their story is that they decide they're going to read the Gospels. They're going to read the New Testament. And when they start with Matthew, which is not maybe the easiest gospel to understand, but that when you start with the Gospel of Matthew, it gives Jesus' family tree. And it is a Jewish family tree. And they trace him all the way back to Abraham. And a part of the genealogy that's given in Matthew tells us that Jesus was related to King David. And so we start here in Kings. When 1Kings starts, David is king of Israel. Now, I never questioned the historicity of David, but I find that many liberal historians and even liberal Christian scholars treat David a great deal like he's the Jewish King Arthur or Robin Hood. But the Bible is not the only place that speaks of David. There are extra biblical accounts. There's no doubt that David his life was epic and he was legendary. But there's no question among serious scholars that he was a real person. He wasn't the first king of Israel. A man named Saul. Saul was with the tribe of Benjamin. God used Samuel, the prophet Samuel, to select Saul to be king. You remember the story that they politically and militarily the people of Israel decided that they wanted to be like the nations around them. So they asked God for a king. We want a king too. Act like it kind of hurt God's feelings. He wanted to be their king, their leader. And God actually told them through Samuel, said, a king's not a great idea. They're going to tax you. They're going to take your young men and put them in the army. They're going to take away your land and, part of your income. They're going to lead you into war. That sounds pretty much like what leaders today do. It seems like the American people, we really don't like war. We don't seek out war, and yet it seems that the people we elect in our whole history seem bent with. It's kind of like the old Territon commercial with the cigarettes, but we'd just about rather fight than switch. And so our history is littered with military conflict. We talk about our independence from England, and yet England is one of our greatest allies today, and the taxes were high. We were decrying no taxation without representation. I had a professor in college. He said that would have been easy to fix. All they had to do was let the colonies elect some representatives and let them send them to London to be representatives. So they could have put them up in big state houses and wined and dined them, and it'd been politics as usual. Somebody like every time Benjamin Franklin or somebody went over to London anyway, that it was party time. They said they could have, didn't have to have a war, didn't have to draw a line in the sand. They could have said, okay, you want representation, let's do it. But God let them have a king. And Saul was a good person, but he and the Lord got turned sideways, and the Lord rejected him from being king. And so Saul had a son named Jonathan, who was the heir apparent. He should have been the king, but Saul and Jonathan both died on the same day in a battle. Before their death, though, God had already had Samuel go and anoint David to be the next king. He wasn't related. He was the tribe of Judah. And that's, when we study King David, we're studying the history of the nation of Israel. And when Saul was king, the nation of Israel was just a bunch of scattered tribes and families, and it was helter-skelter. It was all over the map, and it was really, really tribalism. And they fought each other about as much as they fought anybody else. Something that David did is that he united everybody. He brought everybody, all the Jewish people, under one banner. And he founded a capital in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem, Tel Aviv has been the political capital of Israel, but by almost everybody in the entire world, Jerusalem is considered not to be the center of the religious world and to be the capital of Israel. I've been in Jerusalem a couple of times, and it just feels like you're going back in time. It's just like you're looking at so many ruins there and old structures. The wall has been rebuilt around the city. Of course, cars and buses zipping everywhere, but still camels and goats and things like that. The marketplace probably looks like it did 2,000 years ago. There's a place you can go to in Jerusalem. It's a shrine, and it is presented to the public as the tomb of David. It's right in the city. Tomb of David. And of course there's dispute and people who say, oh, that's not the tomb of David, it can't be. And then there are people who say, oh yes, it most certainly is. And so there is research, and there is a reasonable argument for why that is the body of David is buried there. If you go down through the Kidron Valley, down toward the end of the Kidron Valley, there's a place called the Tomb of Absalom, who was David's son. When we come to 1Kings, David is already very old. He's very, very old. His wife Bathsheba is kind of running things. She's kind of the figure behind the throne. The circumstances that led to he and Bathsheba being together kind of placed her in a position of kind of what I would call or think of as upper-handedness over the king. He is depicted as having seduced her when I think she probably seduced him. They had an adulterous affair. David arranged things so that her husband could be killed, and then he took her as his wife. It's just a tawdry, shameful part of David's life. But if not that, maybe just her own personality, or maybe the personality of David, means that Bathsheba, you changed my life. I didn't ask for this, or I don't know what her arguments might have been. But something seems to have given Bathsheba the upper hand over David in a lot of different ways. David is so old that they actually bring in a young girl to take care of him, and actually to no doubt at all there wasn't anything moral or immoral about their relationship, but she slept in the bed with him, and the Bible says to keep him warm. So I don't know how you apply for that job, but she was probably felt, and she was higher than a concubine, less than a wife, but probably became one of the most appreciated people in David's entire life, as she fed him, bathed him, dressed him, and kept him warm at night. I don't think I really understood everything about that for years, and I know I'm talking to someone who would know. I don't think David was on blood thinners, but as he got older, his blood got thinner, and I tell you what, that's been one thing. I don't know what your temperature is, but I stay cold just about all the time. And so if you look at our house, I have just blankets piled up on me, and Terry's over there throwing the covers off. But David was cold. Well, David had a son named Adonijah, and he figured, well, now's my time to make my move. David had lots of sons by different wives, but Adonijah was going to head to the throne. Well, Bathsheba said no, and her son Solomon was just a child. But she got the prophet and got him to get a cruse of oil and began to finagle things around. And before Adonijah had any idea what was going on, Solomon had been, well, actually Bathsheba came to David and said, Adonijah's trying to take over the throne. So you need, in order to cut that off or nip that in the bud, you need to have Solomon anointed as king. So he did. So here's this little boy, and all of a sudden he's king of Israel. And they kind of went, I don't know if he kind of heard word, or they sent word to Adonijah and said, no, you're not king. Solomon's the king. And so it's like it scared him to death. He thought, instead of rising up, and David was still very popular. And he had overcome Absalom, who had been very, very popular with the people. Adonijah didn't have that kind of popularity or political clout at all. So he pretty much figured if he didn't behave, they'd kill him. So he decided to just back out and say, okay, you're the king. During David's life, David wanted to build the temple. David actually had plans drawn up, and he had material gathered to build the temple, and God wouldn't let him do it. Of all the things, and this may sound unkind, and I may be speaking with someone who has a great admiration for David. Of course, he was a man after God's own heart. But he was a killer. He was a killer. Now we say, oh, well, he killed Goliath. He killed a giant. He killed a lot of people. Evidently, Goliath may have been the first man that young David ever killed, and he killed him on the battlefield. It was war. But when David came and volunteered to go out and face Goliath, King Saul thought it was absurd, and his brothers mocked him. And David said this in so many words. He says, I'm a killer. I know how to kill things. He said, I had a lion came into our flock to get some of the sheep. He said, I killed it. He said, I grabbed that lion by the beard and I smote him. I killed him. He said, a bear did the same thing. I killed that bear. And so his argument to King Saul was, I'm a killer. And he went out and he killed. We make a great deal about the sling. He hit Goliath, but what killed Goliath, it says that David went and stood upon him. He actually got up on top of him and took Goliath's huge sword. He was down because of the rock, but David cut his head off. And I'm thinking, how many teenage boys could do that? I think that he just told that bear story and that lion story. I think maybe they'd been coyotes and wild dogs or whatever, that David was a liquidator. Well, he won the day that day. He wanted to marry the king's daughter, Micah. And Saul didn't want that. So he says, well, I'll tell you what. There's a bunch of Philistines over here. He says, if you'll bring me 100 Philistine foreskins, if you'll go, and I can't imagine any of those Philistines would have given up their foreskin. He's going to have to kill them to take that. He came back with 200. He killed all those people, and he laid that pile of stinking flesh before Saul, and Saul gave him Micah to marry. And when David said, I want to build the temple, God said, oh no. No. He said, you've got too much blood on your hands. He said, your hands are just covered in blood. Now, this is all introductory, and we're just about at the end of our time, but in the first 3 chapters of 1 Kings, David knows that he's dying. I've told you that the piece Adonijah, Solomon's been anointed. So he's on his deathbed. He's breathing his last. So he brings in he brings in Solomon, and he brings in some other servants. And he has a list. And there are people who have wronged David over the years. And David has looked very magnanimous over the years. He's just kind of let things go. But he's about to die. And so in these first chapters of 1Kings, he sends out hit squads. One of them is Joab. When Joab was his captain of the army and Absalom rose up, he told David had strict orders not to harm Absalom. And Joab is the one who found Absalom hanging in the tree by his hair, and Joab killed him. It says he shot his body through with darts. And that was the most tragic thing, I believe, that David ever endured. He grieved over the loss of Absalom. But it looked like, Joab had completely, directly disobeyed a direct order. One of the first things he did was he put together a hit team and he sent them out to kill Joab, and they did. When Absalom was chasing them out of Jerusalem, there was a man who stood up on a ridge above them named Shimei, and he mocked and cursed David and laughed at him as they were fleeing. They were leaving Jerusalem, and they had packed up everything that belonged to David, and they were getting out of Dodge. And Shimei was up there, and some of David's men said, if you just give the word, I'll go up there and I'll whack him right now. David said, no, everything he's saying is the truth, and yes, I deserve it. David was really feeling like he deserved a lot of disrespect. David's on his deathbed here. He says, where's Shimei? And I said, we know right where he's at. We've been keeping up with him. Okay. He'd actually told Shimei if he'd go here and he'd stay right there, he'd leave him alone. Something happened. Shimei had to leave there and go take care of some business, and David heard about it and said, no. And he went over there and they killed Shimei. And so David was one of these people, we can preach great sermons about him. He was without a doubt a great king and a great leader of men. We read the Psalms. There's no question that he loved God and he had a deep passion for God. But even God said, oh, no, you can't build the temple. You've killed You've killed so many people. And, nobody's killed more people than God. But David was close, and he said, no, we can't say the man who built the temple was such a notorious killer. Now, as far as we know, David probably, I won't say that. So David died. And I think we have to be careful. I hope that I've been gracious and long-suffering, patient along and through the years. But every once in a while, I can see where I get a chance or an opportunity for revenge. It just pops up. I see it, maybe just for an individual. Something comes into my hand. Something comes across my path. And I think I want to do better than that. I don't want, when I'm on my deathbed or I'm in my last years, I don't want to say, okay, I was good and I was kind, I left them alone, but now I'm going to get them. Well, I hope that until the day I die that I can just leave that to the Lord. I can say, if you want them to be punished or judged, Lord, you take care of it. But David didn't feel like he was going to be able to rest in peace until he whacked a bunch of people. So, David is not one of my heroes. There are many, many things. I love the Psalms. There are many things about his life that I find admirable. But he was a terrible, terrible father. Anyway, the thrust of our lesson today really is that God came to this little boy who's now king of Israel, Solomon. He says, okay, now you're king of Solomon. You're king of Israel. You're Solomon, king of Israel. And he said, well, I'm going to just ask for something, I'll give it to you. It's a very famous aspect of Solomon's reign. And Solomon said, I'm just young, I'm inexperienced, and I don't know what to do. And so he asked the Lord for wisdom. And the Lord said, well, you could have asked to live a long time or to be rich or powerful. You didn't ask for that. And he says, okay, I'm going to make you the wisest person in the entire world, and I'm going to make you the most powerful king, the richest king, and you're going to live a long time. I mean, you didn't ask for those things. It tells us a little bit about Solomon. It tells us a lot about God. Solomon recorded the book of Proverbs, the book of Ecclesiastes, and we have recently studied those in Sunday school just last year. Solomon was purportedly very wise. But the Bible does tell us that his weakness was that whenever he married a woman, and he married lots of women, he had lots of concubines, but he had many, many, many wives. And the purpose of marrying these wives really was to broaden his influence and to gain power. The way they would have an alliance, instead of just shaking hands or signing a paper, they'd give Solomon a wife, their daughter, to be a wife. So he had lots of wives, but they all brought their gods with them. And since Solomon was taking them away from their daddy and their mama and their religion, they brought their religion with them. And in order to make them feel at home, he probably did a lot of things to make them feel at home. Flew their flag, served the kind of food they'd grown up eating, helped, ordered that particular clothes be made and kinds of jewelry that were very much like they'd grown up around. And they built high places to their gods. So there's no question either that Solomon loved God and believed only in God, but he believed that a part of his responsibility and duty to these women was to allow them to honor their gods. And the thing about it is that it influenced the people of Israel. A lot of the people of Israel followed those false gods, worshiped those gods in the high places. So something that David, there's no indication that David ever allowed that, never permitted that. Solomon was, in spite of all of his wisdom, he allowed all those changes to be made, and it ultimately brought around the corruption and the many, many problems. Because as they forsook the Lord, the blessings of the Lord became very scarce and very rare. God couldn't bless them because they were counting on all these foreign gods for their blessings. I've always wondered how wise a man was to have 1,000 wives. Doesn't sound too smart to me. Well, there's no doubt that he had plenty of opinion to go around, because I imagine all of them had some matter of some element of influence over Solomon. Saw a television program on cable a couple of weeks ago. There are still people that, Solomon lavishly, everything he built from the temple on was, solid gold or gold plated, and silver and diamonds and rubies and everything. And they feel that he must have had some mines where he got all this from. And so people still today are looking for King Solomon's mines, the place where he had it dug out of the ground, where they found all that gold, where they found all those precious metals and stones. Well, there are many, many people who still name their children after David. And the greeting, either the hello and the goodbye in Israel is shalom, and that's how Solomon was named, Solomon. Well, you say you go back to the doctor Thursday?
Friday.
Friday. Well, I hope everything they find it's improving. Or do you have any pain with your hand, or?
Not really any pain. It's sore. I have to be careful not to bump it or anything. So
You'll be picking the banjo before you know it. If there's anybody out there and you tuned in this morning, thank you for joining us today. We're glad that you came in. Join us in a few minutes for our service. I'm looking forward to hearing Brother Thomas preach to us today.